Hello everybody and welcome to parksbros. It's Drew here, and today we're going on a little trip to check out one of the best and potentially most overrated wooden coasters in the world. That's right, we're giving our full in-depth review for the Voyage at Holiday World. The Voyage originally opened on May 6, 2006 at Holiday World in Santa Claus, Indiana. This gigantic wooden coaster stands at a monstrous height of 159 feet tall before it drops you down 154 feet towards the ground to get you up to a top speed of 67 miles an hour. You'll be keeping up that speed for most of the track length as you go across all 6,442 feet of track, making this the longest wooden coaster in the world with one lift hill. And of course, taking that all into account, it has a full duration of 2 minutes and 45 seconds and a duration of 1 minute and 45 seconds from lift hill all the way to that brake run. This ride lasts forever. But of course, now that we know all the basic stats to this ride, let's find out how to get there. First, walking into that front entrance to Holiday World and Splash and Safari, you might be a little bit confused walking around this park. I know I was with my first visit to this park, as you start your visit to the Santa Claus theme park in the Christmas area. Walk past that cool ornament fountain and keep heading straight until you get to the 4th of July section. From this point, you'll make a left turn and keep heading straight down that pathway. You'll eventually see Splash and Safari on your left, but you're going to walk past it on that main path before you end up running into a bridge. This bridge greets you into the Thanksgiving section, to which you'll find the main station building and the queue line for the Voyage, fast approaching on your left-hand side. This station building is rather unassuming and quite plain, and the same goes for the main entrance. There's a bit of exterior queue that typically you won't have to wait through, but it leads into quite a small bridge that leads into a normal-sized doorway. From this point, I kid you not, there's a couple different ways you could go depending on how long the line is. If the line is super short, you'll take the doorway on the left. If the line is a bit longer, you'll take the doorway on the right. I feel like we're riding Indiana Jones Adventure right now. If you end up heading towards the right, you'll go down a set of stairs, get a nice view of the coaster track racing by, take another set of stairs downward, and then this will lead you into what I like to call the cattle pen. This smaller room seems to have hundreds of switchbacks that are very tight, with some older fans to try and keep you cool in that hot and humid summer heat. And boy, oh boy, am I glad to not have waited in this very claustrophobic room while we were at the park. From this point, you'll start heading up another couple sets of stairs and potentially meet up with where you would have with the left-hand door before heading up, yes, some more stairs on the outside of the station before you end up turning left into the station itself, where you'll end up choosing one of 12 rows on this PTC train for this gravity group roller coaster. The station is quite plain as well, with very minimal theming, which includes some netting and maybe some other loose ropes to allude to the Mayflower. Speaking of which, I think it's time to board, so let's check out these trains. Of course, as I mentioned prior, you will choose one of 12 rows, with the 6 cars having 2 rows each for 2 seats per row in the classic PTC train style. If you haven't seen these before, these are what you would consider a classic wooden coaster train, to say the least, as they're not exactly the most ergonomic and their lap bar is not very comfortable either. The seats thankfully have some nice padding, so you end up kind of squishing into the seat a little bit before you put on a seatbelt and pull down that lap bar, which will end up pushing your knees a little bit to the inside of the train itself, while being a completely flat piece of metal with just a little bit of rubber on it. It's not the most comfortable thing, but it can give a little bit more of a breather room depending on your body type, although I will say personally, I did not have the best experience with these trains, as you can probably tell. But with that, it's time. Let's cross the Atlantic and take on the Voyage. As you start this full-on experience, you'll head out of the station rolling slowly before taking a slight left as well as a tiny bit of a pre-drop into the main lift hill as you go underneath one of the final airtime hills on the coaster. There's a little bit of lateral force, if you want to call it that, pushing you side to side, especially if you're towards the back of the train going into the lift hill, but it's nothing to write home about. From this point, you'll head up this massive lift hill that only looks bigger than it actually is before you encounter the very peak, getting this grand view of all of rural Indiana, as well as getting those classic flags at the very top of the lift hill. As you start to crest the lift hill, you'll see in clear view Thunderbird, the B&M wing coaster, which will be dueling with you sometimes depending on when you get the timing right before you plummet into the trees. Especially later at night, it looks like you're diving into a tunnel because you're going underneath the tree cover in such a dense way. This drop does give some pretty stellar airtime, especially if you're towards the back and the ride is running a little bit quicker, but in general, it's not the most impressive first drop on a ride this big, especially during the daytime or if it's running a little bit slower. And since this is a wooden coaster, do expect some roughness at the bottom of these hills. I definitely did. There's just a little bit of a bump towards the bottom of the drop especially, but it's nothing too crazy, and this ride is actually really smooth in comparison to a lot of wooden coasters out there. After diving underneath the tree line, you'll take another upward hill up into the first airtime moment of this coaster, at least if it's running quick enough. Otherwise, you're in for not exactly the best part of the ride. This is before you plummet underneath parts of Thunderbird before vaulting back up into the second airtime hill of this coaster, very similar to the first. Except this time you'll twist a little bit to the left and potentially get maybe a little bit less airtime going into it, but coming out of it, you'll get at least a little bit more. This drop, in my opinion, is much better than the first and second because you dive directly into a tunnel underneath Thunderbird yet again before starting to experience what the Voyage is all about. Unpredictability, some surprise airtime moments, and a lot of lateral forces. You'll pop out of that tunnel for just a brief moment as you twist to the right and get pushed out of your seat with airtime. This is when you might start to get those butterflies in your stomach, especially if you're not used to roller coasters, but you won't have time to think about it as you're diving into another tunnel. You then pop up into another major airtime hill, which then really kicks the ride off, especially going down the drop. You can barely get a glimpse of the rest of the layout in this spaghetti bowl section in the middle of the woods before again diving into a tunnel. This, in my mind, is a standout airtime moment, especially compared to the last couple, and in my mind, this is when the ride really kicks off. Immediately after diving into this tunnel, you'll enter the real world again, twisting to the left before getting snapped to the right while going upward and then downward again. This off-axis airtime hill gives some great laterals and airtime especially. You'll level out before popping up just a tiny bit and twisting to the left and getting into the first real turn of the ride in this kind of halfway helix. There's a small airtime hill about halfway through this turn, and then you enter into one of the more wacky moments of the ride with a flattened airtime hill while you're still heading to the left, giving some really powerful and abrupt lateral forces pushing it to the left. You're still tilting to the left while turning right, so expect those laterals to stay prevalent for the next couple of seconds before you start twisting to the left yet again. In a near 90-degree banked turn that can be quite powerful, especially in the positive G department, pushing you down into your seat. You'll smoothly transition underneath another part of the track as you turn into the right, doing the same type of maneuver but just mirrored, before taking a little bunny hop on that twists you immediately to the left, and then of course going into another tunnel. There's a surprise airtime moment in here before you get lifted up into the mid-course brake run, which if you're paying attention and you have time to breathe at this point, you'll notice you're pretty low to the ground. So how can you make it all the way back to the station? Well, Voyage has a little trick up its sleeve. It actually heads uphill with the second half of the ride coming back down that hill. So be prepared. The ride is still in its prime. For some people, this can be the make or break moment of the ride, especially if those brakes engage during this block section. Now, if you don't know what one of those are, just go check out El Toro Ryan, and we'll talk more about this in the review section. You will either blaze or slowly drop into another tunnel, which gives you a surprise, a triple down. That's right, you hit an airtime hill, level out, get another airtime hill, level out again, and get yet another airtime hill, without going upward at all. And this is all in complete darkness inside the tunnel as you twist to the side just a bit. This can be one of the best moments of the ride very easily, especially if you don't get slowed down during that mid-course brake run at all. With ever increasing airtime pushing you out of your seat more and more and more, almost to the point where you can get bruises on your legs. Then you'll pop out of the tunnel into another very common airtime hill at this point, but underneath the main structure of one of the giant airtime hills that begins the ride, giving a cool head and hand chopper, especially in comparison to the tunnel sections. You'll twist to the right just a tiny bit as you encounter a smaller speed hill, before yet again going underneath Thunderbird as you twist back to the left. There's a small airtime hill which you'll twist the opposite direction out of before twisting left and right in this cool trick track moment, and then of course crossing underneath the Voyage's first couple airtime hills yet again. This is when you really get to start to feel that speed, twisting to the left over and over again, twisting underneath the structure over and over again as well, before quickly twisting to the right and then to the left yet again. As you twist back to the left, make sure to pose or scream or yell or smile or anything you want in that photo, because it'll be on the left-hand side, hiding behind a tree. This is when you'll finally actually go over a part of the Voyage. It's that off-axis airtime hill I brought up right at the beginning of the ride. This can give some stellar airtime, of course, just like many other moments on the ride. And this is the part of the ride where I started questioning, how much longer is this thing going? This thing is already longer than pretty much any other coaster I've ever been on. This is when you'll do kind of a queue flyby, twisting to the right and into a tunnel, which you actually get a view of from in the queue, as I mentioned earlier, at what feels like full speed. You'll twist to the right as you head upwards and then snap to the left in another off-axis airtime moment, diving down towards the left and going underneath one of the pathways of the park. This to me was the roughest moment on the entire coaster. There was a couple jolts here when I rode it in 2022 that did kind of surprise me a little bit, but this was by far the roughest moment of the ride, and it wasn't nearly as rough as some other coasters we rode on this entire Midwest trip. You're in a tunnel underneath the pathway before you pop out and go up towards the right with just a couple bits of airtime before you end up hitting the final brake run directly over that main bridge pathway that welcomes you to the entire Thanksgiving area. From this point, you'll twist to the right, hit that final brake run before slithering into the station, and at this point, you'll hop out of the train once the train is completely stopped and the restraints are released toward the left-hand side, grab your belongings that are in the bins, and walk down the multiple ramps that lead you into that finale gift shop as your voyage has been completed. It's time officially for my personal thoughts and review on this coaster itself now that we've experienced all that it has to offer, well, at least during normal operating hours. This coaster is seen as a legend in the coaster community especially, as it has some legendary night rides as well as specialty events that turn off the brakes for some parts of the ride that will have you begging for there to be less airtime. Now, I'm sure you figured it out by now. One of these main events is called Hollywood Nights. It's once a year and is very limited. But the people who are able to experience the Voyage at night with no trim brakes and after the coaster is run over 12 hours at that point have nothing to say but absolute praise about this roller coaster, and I completely understand. But I will say, this, because of a lot of that talk, was my #1 bucket list coaster for quite a while. I was so excited to get on this coaster. I was definitely let down. I'm typically pretty good about tempering my expectations, but I will say, riding it in the middle of the day when the sun was still out and hitting those trim brakes on the mid-course brake run, this ride almost felt excessive in it not delivering enough to warrant its complete ride time. AKA, by the end of it, I was like, when is this gonna end? I'm kind of over this. Now, before you bash me, I was thankfully, and so thankful in fact, to get a second ride on this roller coaster that changed my mind. And I gotta say, it was probably the best ride on a coaster I've ever had. But we had to wait until about 9 p.m. that night when the sun was completely down and there was a little bit of a drizzle. So we got a rain ride at night in the back row, which that is super circumstantial. Sometimes people aren't able to ride it at night because of park hours or their own schedule. Or there are days, of course, that it might go down. But I will say, just like many wooden coasters, especially in the Midwest, night rides are a whole different roller coaster entirely. The speed just feels like it's going so much faster, and everything just feels more and more powerful. If I'm to compare my two rides, it is a night and day difference. Literally, my first ride in the middle of the day, there were multiple airtime hills that gave absolutely no weightless feeling. And there were some elements that it truly crawled over. But at nighttime, by the third airtime hill, it was unlike anything I had ridden before. And because I only have the two very different experiences, I kind of have to trot down the middle, which leads me into a little bit of a hypocritical position, saying this gave the best coaster ride I've ever had, at least potentially, while also being completely overrated, which kind of breaks my heart a little. Granted, I've said similar things before, like Steel Vengeance was my #1, and I said it was a completely overrated ride. Don't get me wrong, it is still easily one of the best roller coasters in the world, but there are some coaster enthusiasts in the community that I'm in that definitely treat some of these rides like they are a god, which I definitely don't agree with, especially with a ride like the Voyage, where it's so different, with a 6-hour time difference in the day. Anyway, getting off of my podium with my little rant about how I do believe the Voyage is at least a tad bit overrated. This ride can truly give a wonderful experience, especially if you're a wooden coaster fan and don't mind a little bit of the bumps and shakes, as well as some of those surprises in there with lateral forces pushing you side to side. Now, it doesn't have the lateral forces of something like the Legend, its predecessor at the park. It does deliver such a lengthy experience that you can't help but feel absolutely stellar at the end of the ride, at least if it's going quick enough. There are so many different elements to this coaster to pick apart completely, with many of them feeling exactly the same as others, and then of course a couple of those surprise moments that really stand out. If you like a long ride that keeps its speed throughout, this is going to be the coaster for you. And honestly, more than any other coaster that I've ridden, I want more re-rides on the Voyage to get a better and solidified feeling of this coaster, because 2 rides, especially with the difference they had, were not enough. Now, I don't think you'll catch me at Hollywood Nights anytime soon, but I would like another chance at this park to get to check out the rest of the park, as well as more of the coasters over and over again, unlike we did on the day we visited, because of so many different things, whether it be weather, heat sickness, or just general downtime that occurred during our visit. And hopefully we don't have to wait in a majority of that queue line for the Voyage, because oh my goodness, that thing scares me. But I think it's time. Let's move on to my favorites and least favorites of this roller coaster. We'll start with row first. I technically only got to ride in one row on the train, which was row 11, so second to back, which gave a little bit more of a smooth experience than that row 12 seat, so keep that in mind if you're riding these PTC wooden coaster trains, especially. You want to sit in the front half of the car for a smoother experience. But that would definitely be my favorite because it was my only. For least favorite though, I would suspect somewhere in the middle of the train being the most lackluster. Now for favorite and least favorite element, there are so many different parts of this ride that exist that I feel like I have to have 2 for both because I can't really choose. Let's start with my least favorite. It's gotta be that first airtime hill. Even when it was running faster at night in the rain, it still didn't offer much and felt way too slow. That plus the final turn of the ride, which seemed to be the roughest part of the ride as well when I got to experience it, definitely tie for my least favorite moment on this coaster. Now, favorite is gonna be kind of a weird one, with the first I bring up being that random little twist to the right as you're banking to the left. This is a really awkward moment, but man, was just so unexpected and enjoyable on this coaster in both times I got to ride it. And I'll do a little bit of appeasing here and tie it with that triple down in the middle of the ride. It really gets that pace going again, although I will say it can be a little bit painful with how powerful the airtime gets by that third hill. With all that said though, let's officially get to my ratings. If you haven't watched one of these full in-depth reviews before, I do have a little bit of an unorthodox rating system. First, I'll start off with a ski slope rating, pretty much recommending how experienced of a coaster rider you should be before checking this ride out. After that, I'll give a star rating for fun and intensity before heading to, of course, my personal rating out of 10. So, starting with the first rating, that ski slope rating, I would recommend being an experienced coaster rider before checking the Voyage out. To me, it is the most intense coaster at the park just because of the length and the height and the speed, and it being a wooden coaster jostling you around a bit. But it's not the most intense thing in the world. I think if you can take on the Legend and especially Thunderbird, the Voyage should be easily doable for you. So speaking of that intensity, let's go with a 4 out of 5 star rating. Again, I don't think it's the most intense in terms of elements or speed or roughness, but it is incredibly so and the most in the park. Now for fun, this is going to get a 5-star rating. That duration really adds to that. The airtime does as well, and a lot of that speed that it keeps throughout just keeps it going. So an easy perfect score for fun on this. Which then leads me to my rating out of 10, and this is where I'm completely conflicted. After my first ride, I would have given this ride a 9, and that breaks my heart to say it. But after my second ride, it's kind of hard to ignore giving this ride a perfect 10 out of 10. And judging by where I officially placed it in my top 25, I think I'm gonna have to keep it there. If you've seen my top 25 coaster list from back in December, you would know this ride currently sits at my number 6 spot all time. And it sits there with arguably the chance, if I get another couple re-rides, to keep going higher and higher on that list. So I can't wait. But now I wanted to say thank you all so much for watching this entire full in-depth review. And if you're still watching right now, make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and comment down below which coaster you think is the most overrated you've been on. I'd love to know. Or just leave a comment complaining about some of my opinions. That's fine by me. But do remember, it's an opinion. It's not a fact. So at least keep it civil, please. I know you Voyage fanboys can be a lot sometimes. But again, thank you all so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And make sure to stay tuned for Holiday World's coasters ranked, rated, and reviewed by me. That'll be coming out in about a week. And stay tuned for more reviews from Kings Island, Kentucky Kingdom, SeaWorld Orlando, Busch Gardens Tampa, and more coming in the next couple of months. And of course, as always, we'll see you on the next ride.